Imagine waking up with the bank app open, seeing your life savings there, and then walking outside and realizing it can't buy what it used to buy. Not a little. Not inflation is high. Not prices rose. It's gone in your hands like water through your fingers. An egg becomes a luxury item, and the crushing part is not just hunger, it's humiliation. It's the feeling that reality is breaking in slow motion, while everyone around you tries to act normal. This is not a disaster movie. This is not a faraway politics problem you can ignore. This is the kind of economic collapse that teaches a population to internalize defeat. And once people internalize defeat, they stop asking the questions that might have saved them. They stop believing they can change anything. They start bargaining with desperation. They start accepting lies as comfort. Welcome back to The Hidden Self. Today we're not going to talk about inflation as a neutral number. We're going to talk about what economic warfare does to the human mind, how it reshapes loyalty, how it manufactures rage, and how a population becomes easier to steer once their money stops behaving like money. If you think this can't reach you, you're doing the same self-deception every victim does at the beginning. You're assuming the system will protect you. It won't. And here's the uncomfortable truth that will sting. People like to blame leaders, but the deeper trap is that they never examine the structure that trains them to lose. They blame the dictator because it's emotionally simpler. They don't blame the mechanism because mechanisms are harder to fight. Mechanisms are invisible until they aren't. Start with the image that never leaves you once you've seen it. A man holds what should be enough to buy a home. He walks to the market. He asks for a basic item. The price has changed. Not by a small margin. It feels like a joke written by someone who hates you. In Caracas, people have used scales to measure money, not because they're dramatic, but because counting becomes pointless when value evaporates before your eyes. People didn't only lose purchasing power, they lost their relationship with time. Counting cash becomes a ritual for a future that isn't there. Now add another layer. When a currency collapses, what collapses with it is not just prices, it's trust. Contracts become theater. Employment becomes a guess. Savings become a threat to your sanity. Rules become suggestions. Even ethics becomes negotiable because ethics requires stability. A society that can't reliably plan loses its moral backbone. People will still say they believe in order, but their actions will show you the real story. They will do whatever preserves survival one day longer. And that's why hyperinflation is so psychologically violent. It kills patience first, then it kills long-term identity, then it kills the ability to coordinate. People become isolated, individually frantic, privately ashamed. In that condition, your community can't resist. It can only endure. So why would something like this happen to a country that has resources, oil, and a population that clearly understands how hard life can get? Some people will tell you the story is purely internal. Corruption, incompetence, a government that prints money and wrecks everything. And yes, internal failure matters. Bad governance can accelerate collapse faster than any external force. But blaming the government alone is still a psychological tactic, even when you think you're being realistic. It lets you believe the problem is moral weakness inside one team. It hides the possibility that the collapse is engineered through pressure, restriction, and incentives that push a society into a corner where printing money becomes the only available option. Here's the mental mechanism. When you suffocate a country's access to foreign currency, you don't have to fire a gun. You choke the ability to import. You limit inputs. You block spare parts. You disrupt the payment system. You interfere with the plumbing of commerce. Then you wait while reality does the rest. The state tries to keep programs running. It tries to pay salaries. It tries to maintain stability. And if the only tool left is printing, printing becomes a desperate addiction. More money without more production means more prices. More prices mean less confidence. Less confidence means more capital flight. More capital flight means less currency stability. The spiral tightens. Now consider the cruelty. This is not done because the aggressor wants the buildings destroyed. The point is to destroy the mind's anchor points. The point is to break the belief that your effort will compound. The point is to convince people that their labor has no future. Hunger does that. But hunger is not the only weapon. Humiliation does it too. The feeling that your paycheck is a joke after you receive it. The feeling that you can't protect your family. That's the kind of suffering that reshapes ideology in the direction of resignation. Psychological warfare often targets the stomach because the stomach is the fastest messenger. People can resist abstract arguments. They can debate policy. They can protest injustice in theory. But when your child is thin because protein is gone, your political identity becomes fragile. Your brain stops thinking about flags and starts thinking about food. In that state, people don't rise up with strategy. They rage with improvisation, and rage, unstructured, becomes easier to redirect. This is where you have to stop being polite with your understanding. The most dangerous moments in history are not always when people are brainwashed in a cartoon way. They're when people are emotionally exhausted and then offered a story that makes their exhaustion feel meaningful. Someone promises to fix it. Someone promises the enemy is to blame. Someone promises sacrifice is worth it. And people accept because accepting is less painful than facing the fact that the system is too big to overpower. For Venezuela, the numbers that describe outflows are not just statistics. 7 million people leaving is not a migration figure. It is a transfer of human capital, energy, and future. It is the erasure of talent. The young, the competent, the ambitious, the ones with options, they leave first. So the country doesn't just lose workers. It loses the social leadership that builds institutions. It loses the technicians who can keep machines running. It loses the doctors who can train others. It loses the entrepreneurs who know how to create alternatives. So the collapse becomes self-reinforcing. The longer people flee, the harder it is to recover, because recovery requires organization, skill, and momentum. Now imagine what happens when you're the one who stays. You watch your friends escape. You watch your siblings disappear into the unknown. You stay behind with a currency that fails you, a job that can't keep up, and a government that is scrambling like a person running on a treadmill that's set to go faster every day. That creates a special kind of resentment. It is not just against the government, it is resentment against helplessness itself. And when helplessness is the enemy, people will start looking for anyone to blame because blame feels like agency. So what happens when the aggressor's pressure aims to manufacture this kind of helplessness? You get a population that can be pushed into choices that don't look like choices. Loyal to the state and starve. Support a change forced from the outside and still risk losing everything. The entire environment becomes a trap. It doesn't matter which side you choose, desperation punishes you either way. And when punishment is relentless, people stop caring about long-term principles. They start caring about immediate survival. That's how ideology gets hollowed out from the inside. Now we reach a psychological detail most people miss. The currency is not just money. The currency is reality made liquid. When a currency collapses, people begin to treat every promise as suspect because the currency is the most visible promise. It's the proof that tomorrow can be trusted. So when the currency turns into waste, people stop trusting institutions. They don't just switch accounts, they switch identities. Their mind learns promises are traps, systems are lies, you can't plan. And that creates another subtle effect. Once a foreign currency becomes the practical unit of value, the local currency becomes a humiliating prop. People start believing the foreign currency more than their own government's words. Dollars become a meter for reality. Prices stop being measured by local authority and become measured by external confidence. This is a surrender of cognition, not a surrender with flags, a surrender in your head. If you're thinking, okay, but that's just economics, you are missing the key psychological event. When people internalize that their local government cannot protect value, they stop expecting protection from the same system that collects taxes and enforces law. Once expectations collapse, compliance changes. People evade. People move money. People barter. People treat the state as a temporary inconvenience rather than a stable authority. That's when the social fabric becomes negotiable. Here's the bitter irony that makes the story even darker. The aggressor claims to fight for certain ideals, certain freedoms, certain sovereignty. But the mechanism is to turn the population's survival behavior into a form of dependency. Even if the targeted leader remains in office, the real power shifts. The targeted country still might print money, still might issue decrees, but the pricing power and transactional reality become external. The government's formal authority remains, but the practical authority is elsewhere. That's how you win without occupation. You win by occupying the value system. Now we need to talk about time horizons, because hyperinflation is also an assault on planning. In the early stages, people still believe they can wait it out. They still believe their salaries will catch up. They still believe there will be reform. In later stages, they stop planning, because planning becomes delusion. People shift from saving to scavenging. They stop buying tomorrow and start buying now. They stop investing in skills that pay later, because later is a joke, and when later is gone, the future economy collapses. A society cannot build when its participants refuse to imagine a stable tomorrow. In a sense, that's the deepest harm. It's not just lost wealth, it's the death of the time-based self. Your identity becomes survive today. Your ambition becomes smaller. Your moral courage shrinks. Your risk-taking becomes frantic instead of strategic. And those psychological changes are difficult to reverse, even if the economic conditions improve later. Now let's go deeper into the mechanism of financial warfare, because this is where people get lazy and start cheering for simplistic narratives. They want a villain, a hero, and a clean story. Reality is messier and more terrifying because it's procedural. It's policy. It's coordination between sanctions, banking restrictions, and the manipulation of access to trade finance. It's also the weaponization of payment networks. If you cut a country off from global settlement systems, you don't just hurt exports. You hurt trust. You make commerce unpredictable. You raise the cost of doing business. You force companies into informal channels. And once you force informal channels, you create a parallel economy. That parallel economy becomes a survival machine, but it is also a breeding ground for corruption, because survival systems don't have the same accountability as formal ones. People start bribing to move goods. Middlemen appear, prices become arbitrary, the system becomes opaque, and opacity is fertile ground for power plays. Everyone is constantly guessing. Everyone is negotiating under pressure. That's how you weaken institutions without needing to topple one single building. Now imagine the aggressor's problem. If pressure is too heavy, collapse can happen, but collapse can also become chaotic in ways that don't produce the desired outcome. The goal is not simply destruction. The goal is the creation of a predictable kind of weakness, a weakness that channels behavior toward compliance. That's why economic warfare has a logic that resembles behavioral conditioning. Pressure is applied in ways that make certain behaviors the only option. If foreign currency becomes too risky to use, people cling to whatever is safer. If certain imports are blocked, people substitute. If the state tries to stabilize prices, it runs out of money, and then the currency collapses again. Each cycle teaches a lesson. Stability is impossible under the current constraints. So the targeted country becomes a laboratory, not in a clean way, but in the way oppressed societies always adapt. Venezuela, in this narrative, becomes a survival laboratory where alternative payment routes are used, alternative assets are used, and markets are built around avoiding the standard system. When enough countries can survive the pressure, the weapon becomes less effective. That's where the aggressor recalibrates. Not by admitting failure, but by turning up the complexity, tighter enforcement, expanded restrictions, more fear about alternatives. And now we hit a truth that will make many viewers uncomfortable. The aggressor is not just motivated by morals or security in a clean way. It is also motivated by the maintenance of a global monetary order. Debt and currency dominance are linked. If the dominant currency destabilizes, the system that props up global trade becomes fragile. And in an empire built on financial leverage, stability is an obsession. Financial dominance is not just power, it is revenue. It is the ability to borrow cheaply. It is the ability to export inflation. Think about that. If a country's currency is used globally to buy a critical resource, then global demand props up its value. Then that country can print and borrow while the cost is absorbed elsewhere. In such a system, inflation becomes something you export to other people. Other people pay with their purchasing power. Other people suffer in the markets and at the kitchen table. The empire sees price stability at home longer, while the bill is delayed and shifted outward. This is why, in this story, the aggressor cannot allow a major resource economy to successfully sell outside the dominant currency. It's not about hating one leader, it's about defending the plumbing of the empire. If one country breaks the pattern, the domino effect threatens the whole architecture. And empires hate dominoes. They prefer the comfort of predictable obedience. Now, I need you to notice something about how viewers typically respond to this kind of story. Some people will react with moral outrage and then stop there. That's not enough. Outrage without analysis becomes entertainment. Entertainment feels like power, but it's just emotional consumption. Real power begins when you ask, what does this mean for me? How does this pattern exist in everyday life? Because psychological warfare is not only a geopolitical thing, it's a human thing. The method is the same, whether it's a nation under siege or an individual being managed by fear. You break the anchor, you create dependency on external systems. You remove options. You train the mind to accept the unacceptable. You make choice feel like the only remaining illusion. So let's bring this down to the personal level, because the hidden self is about the internal mechanism. If you grew up in an environment where your money was unstable, you learn to trust volatility more than trust. You learn to read moods the way others read weather. You learn to anticipate punishment before it arrives. That is psychological warfare too, just at a smaller scale. When your financial system fails, your identity shrinks. You stop imagining big things because big things require safety. You start making decisions that preserve survival rather than build dignity. And the moment you live in survival mode, you become easier to manipulate. Not because someone is evil in a cartoon way, because your mind becomes a hostage to urgency. In Venezuela's story, urgency is manufactured. Pressure creates urgency. Urgency creates compliance. Compliance creates narratives. The system then feeds on the narratives to keep pressure looking justified. It becomes a self-sustaining loop. The population suffers, then someone offers an explanation that blames an enemy. Then the suffering continues because the mechanism remains in place. Now let's talk about the hidden self component directly. Many people in collapse environments learn to dissociate. They numb out. They stop feeling because feeling is too expensive. When you're constantly calculating whether you can eat, dreaming feels like betrayal. When you see your country losing value, pride feels childish. And when pride feels childish, resistance becomes psychologically punished. That's when a population can be trained to cooperate with its own decline. Not because they consent freely, but because consent becomes their last defense